The clock read 2:47 a.m. when Richard Kane pushed open the door of a supply closet on the 9th floor of his own company and found a man curled up on the cold tile floor, using a folded janitor's uniform as a pillow. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then the man's eyes snapped open in pure terror, and Richard realized he was staring into the exhausted face of someone who had clearly been sleeping there for a very long time. If this story moves you even a little, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me you believe in second chances, share this with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 3 weeks earlier, Richard Kane had been sitting in a boardroom on the top floor of Kane Logistics, staring at a quarterly report that made no sense to him. Employee turnover in the custodial and warehouse divisions had spiked by nearly 40% in 8 months. Productivity was down. Complaints were up. And yet, according to every manager who reported to him, morale was stable. Richard had built this company from a single delivery van and a dream 22 years ago. He had slept in his car more nights than he could count during those early years, eaten cold soup out of a can because he couldn't afford to heat it, and promised himself that if he ever made it, he would build a company where no one else had to suffer the way he once did. Somewhere along the way, between the mergers and the stock options and the quarterly earnings calls, he had lost touch with the people who kept the lights on in his own building. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their stories. He only knew numbers on a spreadsheet, and the numbers were lying to him. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going undercover. Not the flashy television kind of undercover with hidden cameras and dramatic reveals, but something quieter and more honest. He shaved off the neatly trimmed beard he'd worn for a decade, put on a pair of second-hand work boots, and had his assistant, the only person who knew the truth, set him up with a fake identity and a night shift janitorial position under the name Rick Coleman. He told his family he was attending an executive retreat overseas. In reality, he spent his nights mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and scrubbing bathroom tiles in the very building where his name was engraved on a brass plaque in the lobby. The first night was humbling in ways he never expected. His back ached after 2 hours. His hands blistered from the mop handle. He watched younger employees stay late, eating dinner at their desks while he wiped down the break room, and he began to understand, for the first time in years, what it actually felt like to be invisible in the place you gave your life to. But nothing prepared him for what he would find on the 9th floor, in a storage closet nobody used, tucked behind the old filing archives. It was during his second week undercover that he noticed something strange. Every night around 2:30 a.m., an older janitor named Walter would disappear for nearly an hour. Walter was in his early 60s, with kind, tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly when he held his coffee cup. He moved slower than the other custodial staff, but he worked with a quiet dedication that Richard found himself admiring. Walter never complained, never asked for help, and never seemed to notice when younger coworkers walked past him without so much as a nod. Richard decided to follow him one night, telling himself it was simple curiosity, though somewhere deep down he already sensed there was a story waiting to be uncovered. He watched Walter slip into the old supply closet on the 9th floor, and when 10 minutes passed without him coming out, Richard gently opened the door and found him asleep on the floor, a folded uniform beneath his head, his half-eaten sandwich sitting untouched beside him. Walter jolted awake, scrambling to his feet so fast that he knocked over a box of paper towels, apologizing frantically, begging Richard, whom he believed to be just another new hire named Rick, not to report him. He explained through broken breaths that he wasn't lazy, that he had never missed a shift in 11 years, and that he simply needed a few minutes to rest because his body wasn't cooperating with him the way it used to. Richard sat down on an overturned bucket across from him and asked, gently, why he was really sleeping in a closet instead of going home to rest properly between shifts. What Walter told him over the next 20 minutes would stay with Richard for the rest of his life. Walter explained that he worked 2 jobs. During the day, he cared for his wife, Dorothy, who had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia 3 years earlier. He could not afford a full-time caregiver on a janitor's salary, so he became one himself, feeding her, bathing her, reminding her every morning who he was because some days she looked at him like a stranger. At night, he came to Kane Logistics to clean, because the health insurance covered through his job was the only thing standing between his wife and a series of medications that cost more than his monthly paycheck. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night in over a year. He used his 10-minute breaks and any spare moment he could steal to close his eyes in that closet, not because he didn't care about his job, but because he cared about it too much to risk falling asleep on a public floor where a customer or supervisor might see him and think he was neglecting his duties. Richard sat frozen, listening to a man who had given everything he had to two responsibilities that never stopped demanding more. A man who never once asked the company for help, who never filed a complaint, who simply carried his burden silently because he believed that was what a good employee, a good husband, a good man was supposed to do. Richard asked him if management knew about his situation. Walter laughed softly, without bitterness, and said that in 11 years no one from the corporate offices had ever asked him his last name, let alone about his wife. That single sentence hit Richard harder than any failed business deal or product recall ever had. He had built policies, hired directors, approved six-figure salaries for people who had never once walked the floors where the real work happened. He thought about his own beginnings, about the nights he slept in his car, about how one act of kindness from a stranger, a gas station owner who gave him a job and never asked questions when Richard couldn't pay for gas, had changed the entire course of his life. He realized, sitting on that overturned bucket at 3 a.m, that somewhere in the last 2 decades, he had become the kind of person his younger self would not have recognized. He didn't reveal his identity that night. Instead, he told Walter that his shift was ending, gathered his supplies, and walked out into the empty parking lot, sitting in his car for nearly an hour before he could bring himself to drive home. The next few days felt different. He began paying closer attention to every person he worked alongside. There was Marisol, a single mother of 3 who worked the overnight shift because daycare during the day was cheaper, sacrificing sleep to make sure her children had breakfast and clean clothes for school. There was James, a 19-year-old who had aged out of the foster care system with nowhere to go, sleeping in his car in the parking garage some nights because rent had become unaffordable after a rate hike near the warehouse district. None of these stories showed up in quarterly reports. None of them were visible from the 9th floor boardroom. They were only visible from the floor itself, mop in hand at 2 a.m, when the building was quiet enough to hear the truth. Richard spent his final week undercover gathering names, stories, and quiet observations, filling a small notebook he kept tucked inside his uniform pocket. He learned that the company's health insurance plan, the one he had approved years earlier without much thought, had a coverage gap that left workers like Walter paying nearly 60% of certain medication costs out of pocket. He learned that overnight shift workers were not eligible for the same childcare stipend that daytime corporate employees received, an oversight nobody upstairs had ever noticed because nobody upstairs had ever needed it. He learned that the company had, without meaning to, built 2 separate worlds within the same walls, one where struggle was invisible, and one where struggle was the only thing that existed. On his last night undercover, Richard found Walter in the closet again, but this time, instead of sitting across from him as Rick the janitor, he simply asked if he could bring him something warm to drink from the vending machine down the hall. Walter, surprised by the small gesture, accepted gratefully, and the two of them talked for nearly 40 minutes about nothing in particular, about football, about the neighborhood Walter grew up in, about the small garden he used to keep before Dorothy's illness made it impossible to find the time. In that ordinary conversation, Richard found something he had been missing for years without even realizing it. Connection. Not the kind measured in shareholder value, but the kind measured in shared humanity. The following Monday, Richard Kane returned to the office as himself, clean-shaven, in his tailored suit, walking through the same lobby he had walked through for over 2 decades, but something in him had shifted permanently. He called an emergency meeting with his executive leadership team, and, instead of opening with financial projections, he opened by reading Walter's story aloud, along with Marisol's and James's, refusing to use their real names at first, letting the room absorb the weight of what these employees faced every single day while the company's stock price continued to climb. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few looked genuinely stunned. One quietly admitted he had never once set foot in the custodial break room in the 4 years he had worked there. Richard announced sweeping changes that same day. He restructured the health insurance plan to eliminate the coverage gap that had been quietly bankrupting families like Walter's for medications and treatments. He extended the childcare stipend to overnight and warehouse staff, closing a divide that should never have existed in the first place. He created an emergency assistance fund, seeded with $2 million of his own personal wealth, available to any employee facing a housing crisis, a medical emergency, or a family hardship, No lengthy approval process, no bureaucratic hoops, just a phone call and a same-week response. He mandated that every executive, himself included, would spend 1 week each year working alongside frontline staff, not as a publicity stunt, but as a standing company policy meant to keep leadership permanently tethered to the reality of the people they served. Then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, Richard walked down to the custodial break room himself, something no CEO in the company's history had ever done, and asked to speak with Walter privately. Walter's hands trembled as he sat down, certain he was about to be fired for something, his mind racing through every possible mistake he might have made. Instead, Richard told him the truth, that he was Rick, the new janitor Walter had confided in weeks earlier, that he was also Richard Kane, the man whose name was on the building, and that everything Walter had shared with him that night in the supply closet had changed the direction of the entire company. Walter sat in stunned silence, tears welling in his eyes, as Richard explained that Dorothy's medical bills would now be fully covered under the new insurance plan, that a home health aide would be provided during the day so Walter could finally get real rest, and that his position, along with a substantial raise, would remain secure for as long as he wanted it. Walter broke down completely, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming release of 11 years of carrying a burden he believed no one would ever see or understand. He told Richard that he had stopped believing anyone at the top of the company, even new custodial staff, existed as human beings, let alone cared about what they went through when the lights went out and the offices emptied. Richard, fighting back his own tears, told him that he was the one who had opened his eyes, that sometimes the people we walk past every single day are the ones who have the most to teach us about what truly matters. Word of what happened spread quickly through the company, not through a press release, but through the honest, human way that real stories travel, one coworker telling another in hushed, amazed voices. Employees who had felt invisible for years suddenly felt seen. Productivity did not just recover, it soared, because people who feel valued work differently than people who feel forgotten. Turnover in the custodial and warehouse divisions dropped to nearly zero within 6 months. Richard began sending weekly, unscripted notes to all employees, sharing what he had learned on the floor, admitting his own past blindness, and reminding everyone that no title, no matter how impressive, made one person's dignity worth more than another's. If this story touched your heart even a little, I want you to take a moment right now to comment below and tell me one act of kindness you either witnessed or experienced that you will never forget. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you believe that leaders should walk among the people they lead, that no one should ever feel invisible in the place where they spend most of their waking hours, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe so more stories like this one can reach the people who need them most. Before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something important. Please type the word "seen" in the comments below if this story reminded you that every person, no matter their job title, deserves to be noticed, valued, and treated with dignity. I read every single comment, and I would love to know this story reached you. Walter continued working at Kane Logistics for 3 more years before retiring with a full pension and a small garden once again blooming in his backyard, tended to on weekends with Dorothy by his side during her better days. Richard Kane never forgot the lesson that a supply closet on the 9th floor taught him at 2:47 in the morning. That greatness is not measured by how high you climb, but by how far you are willing to bend down to see the people standing quietly beside you the entire time. Sometimes the most important discoveries in life are not made in boardrooms or quarterly reports, but in the smallest, most overlooked corners of the places we call home, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to open the door.